Welcome to this chess video, everyone. So this time we'll be taking a look at a common chess pattern that's known as the night attack. And it is night as in like daytime, nighttime, not like the chess knight. And so we're gonna actually see what this pattern is and how this actually can come up. And it's a really cool sacrifice. So if you can learn this pattern, it's just one more little idea that you can add to your, basically your chess toolkit. I want to show two examples. But for the first example, this is a 1928 game from Spielmann and Walter. And so for this one, the knight attack we'll be playing is the white side, but we'll just have to get to that point first because this is usually a pattern that comes up in the opening. So we start with pretty normal moves here. We get the Caro-Kann to start off with. Now we get a little bit of a strange move order, but it's still a completely fine variation that we could play. And so here with e5, this knight on f6 actually has to, get going, so he can't stay there too long. He goes knight to e4, perfectly fine move. And now here, this is kind of the first, I'd say, fairly important point, where I would probably prefer to just play pawn d4 and just really secure your center. Then you have a really nice, pawn grip in the center and a little bit of a space advantage. Now here instead we have queen e2, which is a completely fine move as well. This one, it blocks in your bishop a little bit, but whatever the case, this is what he played. So he trades knight on c3, we take back, they play b6, probably trying to get the bishop developed somewhere either to b7 or possibly even a6, depending on what happens. And so now we have knight d4. And knight d4 is kind of a tricky move, because with this idea, he's advancing his knight, of course, but he's also hoping that black will take the bait and play c5. And that kind of sets up a kind of a little trap here. So they do play c5, and now completely unexpected, Walter, I'm sure. Now we get this knight attack pattern, and this pattern involves this pawn here. And this knight actually isn't always there, and this queen isn't always here either. It is specifically just this pawn, and the whole idea is we're actually advancing this pawn to e6. And this is a genuine pawn sacrifice. And so the idea is that if they take this pawn, this is kind of the pattern that we have here. So this is basically what our knight attack ideal setup would look like. And so why do we sacrifice the pawn here? And why does white actually have compensation for this? So first of all, it's very easy to see that, black's pawns are doubled. And so the fact they have doubled pawns, that's kind of a small benefit that helps. We've also ruined their pawn structure in the sense that now their king is weak. So maybe they could be vulnerable to checks, in this case like queen to h5 right away. And so things like that are small things, but I don't think those alone would justify an entire pawn. So why is the sacrifice actually good? So the reason it gets its name night attack, as in like daytime, nighttime, is because the whole point of the sacrifice is to catch your opponent's pieces asleep. You're trying to literally catch them during the night, and in this case that refers to development. These pieces are going to have a lot of trouble getting out. I mean, just take a look at this, f8 bishop, for example. Both of these pawns not doing so great for that bishop, and especially this e7 pawn. Usually you want to push that to e6 and then get your bishop developed somewhere along this diagonal. The problem is, that diagonal's not so available, and you have this pawn sitting in front. Extremely difficult to try and get developed. And so because of this, it's actually justifying the pawn sacrifice because black will have a lot of problems developing. Also notice in some lines this bishop might actually be kind of stopped, and maybe that bishop will also have trouble developing. So at the very least, you're stopping these two pieces from getting developed quickly, and possibly even this third piece. So all of that together to slow their development is oftentimes worth the one pawn. Now here, this was a very short game, so we'll actually finish the game because this was a really quick miniature that happened. We went with queen to h5 check. They had to move their king unless they wanted to go g6, and then that would weaken their king further. So now he just saves the knight, completely moves back, completely fine, no problems here. King moves over. We have knight to e5. They're trying to catch up in development. We have this knight fork. They move their queen over, so that way you can't take the rook right away, because then you would lose your own queen. Alright, then after that, we have this queen check to get out of the pin. They have to move their king over to b7. And now we have bishop f4. Now taking the rook was of course playable, but bishop f4 is even more direct because they're going right after the vulnerable king. You're going straight for checkmate. So here they push a pawn to c4, and we have check, king to a6, and now knight to d8. Kind of an interesting looking move, but it's going to really help support their pieces, and white actually is really closing in. There isn't really much that black can do. And so they play knight to c6, trying desperately to catch up and develop something, but already Spielman finds forced checkmate. And so here we have queen to b7 check, king over to b5, a4 check, king to c5, and then a really nice queen sacrifice, which has to be accepted. Queen captures c6. And this check is really strong because their only legal move is they have to accept the queen. They have to play bishop captures d7, and now that removes the defender of this pawn, and so the game actually ends with knight captures e6, and that is a short checkmate. Now going back to the original knight attack position here, our knight attack pattern comes up with this, where the whole idea is this pawn taking back. Now, not always will this knight be here, but just for the purposes of this game, I'll just show really briefly why they couldn't take that knight. So if they had taken that knight, the problem is now they have queen to b5 check, and you see that you have to block somewhere, probably on d7, and already you're getting the material back. This move, that would just drop the knight, and then you would still have the same fork, so we're not going to look at that. But, you know, if they block with knight, bishop, or a queen here, they're going to lose material. And the best move is actually, in this case, just play bishop d7, and that's even losing here because you can just take this pawn, king takes, you play this queen check, and now after e6 you can just win the rook in the corner. So that's why the knight couldn't be taken in that line. But not always will there be a literal knight on d4 back in this knight attack pattern. The whole idea is you have them basically forced to double their pawns or ruin their structure, and then they're going to be stuck with this development problem, specifically these two pieces here especially. But okay, but not always will it go that great for us. So here, let's take a look at an example. So you can see if you're the black pieces, how should you actually deal with this? So what happens if your opponent ends up doing this to you? So here's a game from 1923. And so here we'll see how Alekhine as black actually gets out of this knight attack that was played against him. So here's this knight attack, and this time it can come up from many different openings. It doesn't have to be the exact same move order that we looked at. And so here we start with this Alekhine's defense, kind of ironic, knowing who we're playing here with Alekhine's black pieces. We have knight c3 developing, that's fine. d5 also contesting the center, fine for opening principles. And now we have e5, which of course is going to try and provoke that knight to move back. And knight after d7 was played, which is a fine move. It's not objectively bad by any means. But this move does actually allow the knight attack. We can actually play pawn to e6 and play this knight attack immediately. Now, this actually was not played in the game, but it was certainly a possibility that could have been played. So in the real game, they actually played pawn to d4, and so after pawn to d4, notice that if they really wanted to stop the knight attack as black, you could just play pawn to e6, and then they have no knight attack ideas, and you can probably develop this bishop and get safely castled. But if you're not too worried about that, then pawn to c5 is also a good move for black here. In the real game, they went pawn to c5. We have a few normal looking moves coming up here. Just a developing move. They develop as well. Same thing for both sides. They provoke our bishop. We capture. Captures back. And now we finally have pawn to e6. And this is the knight attack pattern that we have. And so how does Alekhine get out of this as black? Because it sure looks like his development is going to be kind of a problem after he captures this pawn. And so almost always, the best way to get out of this knight attack is to realize that your development is worth a lot more than a pawn. And so what you have to do is you actually have to get rid of your doubled pawn. Just give the material straight back. And so he plays e5 here to just give the material back. And then, of course, when they accept the material, now you just play e6. And you bring the rear doubled pawn that's now been undoubled just had one square, which couldn't have done before. And now you just develop. You just literally get this bishop out, you get castled, and hopefully you can have a solid game. So in general, that's kind of how you get out of this knight attack pattern if it's played against you. And once again, this pattern can come up in many different openings, not just the two that we looked at. So it's a common theme that comes up. If you're, curious enough to be looking for it, you very well might find it in your own games. So I hope this knight attack was useful for everyone. Thanks for stopping by. I'll see you in the next chess video.